We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
The boys and young men of this next generation coming up are craving guidance. They're craving healthy role models. And guess what? They're not getting them. We are not meeting them and their needs where they are, because I judge many of us from older generations are sitting here going, well, you know what's wrong with the Zoomers? You know what's wrong with Gen Z? Just like our parents did to us and their parents did to them. But perhaps we need to approach them differently. Perhaps there's a better way to meet the needs of young boys and men as they're trying to figure out an incredibly confusing and difficult time to be a young person. Social media causing all these pressures and knocking on it negatively to the mental health of our young folk, as well as uncertain prospects for the future. Let's just say the American dream being very uncertain, whereas for folks like myself, millennials, we were able to kind of catch the last good bits of it, you could say. So this is why I'm excited to invite Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski, who is an absolute beacon, a shining light, who's out there creating wonderful content. He's doing impactful research, and in today's conversation is going to give us a deeper understanding as to why boys are falling behind girls in almost every measurable academic category, why they're 6 times more likely to have an ADHD diagnosis, 3 to 5 times more likely to be expelled, reporting higher levels of loneliness than previous generations. It's time for us. When there is an absence of positive, healthy male role models out there, it's up to us to step in and be those role models. And it starts by doing our work. As we say over and over and over again on this show, it starts with us. And then in today's episode, we're going to get into different ways that we can then engage these younger folks. This is the Mankind Podcast. G'day and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than one way to be a man. And the way that we do that is by inviting inspirational and just intellectual people that are in the work, in the trenches, doing the research. And it allows people like me, a self-proclaimed layman, to better understand how I can better show up as a husband, as a father, as a man, perhaps address some of the inner child stuff I got going on, and that allows all of you to do the same. So today we are joined by Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski. I found you on Instagram, my friend, where all the positive role models live. I must say. I saw you amidst the chaos and some messages you were putting out there with your content and your page, Remasculine. And it gave me so much hope that your content was getting picked up and getting followed. You've got millions of views in your videos, and you do a fantastic job of just simplifying conversations and topics that are often very controversial and often elicit a lot of heated emotions. So firstly, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you're doing, and welcome to the Mankind Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So give us just a quick little background into the work that you're doing and how you found yourself here, because I understand you were an educator before you got into your research.
Yes, I was a high school teacher, and I don't want to overestimate or overstate the value of an experience that I had in my second year teaching when my favorite student, who happened to be a male, died from suicide. And that really impacted me, obviously. And when I did my master's in special education, I was really focused on social emotional well-being, and found out 81% of students diagnosed with emotional behavioral disorders are male. And I looked into why is that, how much is biology? I was a biology teacher and a history teacher. And so how much is socialization, how much is biology? And as you mentioned, we can get into that debate, but at the end of the day, both forces are powerful. Biology is powerful, socialization is powerful. And I led a group for grade 11 boys who were deemed at risk. And that was a really powerful experience. I felt like when you're on the ground with people, it's like you see the tension of their context, and everything, like behavior makes sense in the context in which it arises from. And you also see how sometimes those are very maladaptive and hurt people around them. And long story short, that led me to wanting to focus on masculinity and emotions particularly more. And so I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, focused on what's the difference between the most emotionally restricted teenage boys and the most emotionally expressive teenage boys, and how far apart are they, what makes some of them able to be resistant, what makes some of them not. And I also work now, I do teach at a local university near Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm a consultant for school districts, and also lead and create programs for teenage boys.
Mm. Well, if you aren't already aware of Ashanti Branch and the work he's doing with the mask, okay, so Ashanti's a huge, a very common guest on the show, very dear friend of mine.
Awesome.
And he's actually the original. This used to be an iteration called Masks Off Monday, and he was who inspired that. We did 60 episodes. It got a lot of attention, and then the Mankind podcast was born from that. So I love how worlds collide. This is really cool.
Well, here's how my world collided with him is that in my first program I ever created, I would show clips from the documentary The Mask You Live In.
There you go.
And which he's featured on.
Yes.
And that documentary, I highly recommend if people haven't watched it. Like, I had these teenage boys who were super disinterested in school that after I showed them like the first half-hour clip, the very first time I did, and then we debriefed it, after I paused it, I've never had this happen in any of my classes before, but they gave it a round of applause.
Wow.
And it was like, I think that just speaks to how much it resonated with their experience in a way that they felt seen for the first time. So yeah, Ashanti's doing great work.
So let's look at that. Let's look at why it resonated and why it took having to watch 30 minutes of it for them to really, in a sense, out themselves as having those feelings and agreeing with the message. How, through your research and through your experience as a teacher, how have we gotten to this place? And I understand that's a big, so you can give us the 30,000 foot view of it, but what are some of the elements that have caused this to occur in your experience and research?
And what you're talking about occurring, you mean like the state that teenage boys are in?
Yeah, just where teenage boys are right now. 6 times more likely to have ADHD diagnosis, 4 times more likely to be expelled or suspended, 4 times more likely to take their lives. Like, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can look at it from the 30,000 foot lens and being like, the world is changing so dramatically, even like cost of living nowadays, like prospects of a better future, the optimism of our parents' generation of like that things can get better isn't so widely held in the common zeitgeist of like, oh, the environment, things like who knows what the future holds. Right. So that leads to existential crisis, uncertainty, more like, what's the point? What am I going for? Yeah, but I would say
25 years too early. All right, you're not 40 yet.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say like what's heightened at the teenage stage is that so many elements, but one is that masculinity and being a man is under the magnifying glass more than it's ever been before. And I think that is needed. And I also think that look under the magnifying glass has highlighted, in my opinion, a lot of accurate ways of what not to be, but it hasn't highlighted as many ways of how to be. And so there's a vacuum of guidance and role modeling because there's a resistance to that introspection of what has been harmfully associated with masculine socialization. But there's also just a widespread lack of consistent community for a lot of boys growing up. And it's the time period where a lot of parents think that boys are easier to raise than girls because they think that teenage boys especially are less emotional than teenage girls. So they kind of go more hands off, and it can seem that way. But there actually is a need for more guidance, because one of the things that I will hone on the most is how many teenage boys that I researched, that I interviewed, have a strong sense of loneliness. And we know that with loneliness, there's so many different elements to that. And we're not talking about how many friends they have or not, but it's very similar to Dr. Brene Brown saying that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And teenage boys, the culture is so much with masculinity. It can be about posturing. What is the masculinity? What's the way of presenting yourself that is the most sought after, that gives you the most authority or respect amongst your peer group? And so you have this heightened state of trying to fit in, but you don't actually feel seen. And so that goes back to, why do those boys clap for that documentary is because I think they saw themselves seen at a time where they feel alone, and the boys in my research feel like no other teenage boy is even going through what they're going through. And that is just a huge fallacy. But if we don't actually talk about that or have a culture where there's intergenerational guidance as well to help people walk through that stage, then we create a cesspool of loneliness and hopelessness.
It compounds for kids because it's like, oh wait, so I'm toxic inherently because I at the age of 14, 15, 16 don't know how to separate or understand the difference between masculinity, manhood, and who I am and my own identity. And if all these traits get lumped together, then inherently I'm not good.
Yes, I would definitely say some boys
Yeah.
feel that with the toxic masculinity discourse, but I would say the majority of boys that have issues with the term toxic masculinity, it's more that they actually, at least the boys that I talk to, they're like, oh, I understand the critique, but that's not actually who people want in the world. They feel like they do want, like, that girls are attracted to the boys that have more of these toxic traits. And like, they don't actually want me to be emotional. They want me to be emotionally stoked. They want me to be the shoulder to cry on. So I know that there's a lot of young men who feel like the toxic masculinity is telling boys that they're bad. My experience with teenage boys has been, yes, that's some of them, but the majority is like they understand the argument of what it's saying, but they don't really understand what to do about it because it's still kind of seen as what actually has social power, especially amongst teenagers.
Man, you know, that gives me a little bit of a self-check to give teen boys a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt that they can intellectually piece between these things, where I just assume that based on my teenage experience that it was there was no map, the lights were turned off, and I have no idea how to figure out this thing. Certainly trying to fit in was a big part of that. It makes me think of a conversation I had with my niece. She was probably 2 years ago. She was 11. And she was telling us about these boys that were being rude or mean or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry you went through that. She goes, it's okay. We canceled them. And I'm like, what do you mean by cancel them? She's like, well, they're toxic masculines. And so we don't talk to them anymore and we shut them out. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that you're bullying. She goes, I'm not a bully. They're a bully because they're these things. They're bad. And I said, you're casting them out. You're pointing out where they're wrong. And it takes me back to Tony Porter's work with A Call to Men and she's 11. Gosh, she gets a big pass, a huge pass. But so all I was trying to bring attention to was like, and I wasn't trying to shame her in any way, but just to invite her into going, boys don't know what's going on when they're starting to discover themselves. And that's how I communicated to her. I understand that's not the case. So, I mean, it was just whole kind of like the sad experience and feeling that and hearing about these boys who, you know, on the movie screens, they're the villain, right? In media, they're the villain. And it's, how do we draw that compassion?
Yeah, how I would answer that or say is that people don't exist as boxes. And so like I have worked with if you were a fly on the wall with the boys that I work with, often in one conversation, someone could be looking and be like, that's the epitome of toxic masculinity. They're toxic. And then in the next conversation, or even that conversation could then change, and then you'd hear an excerpt of it and be like, oh my goodness, they're such a beacon of positive masculinity. And so I would say that most boys and men's masculinities are very complex and contradictory at times. Is that like there's some things that I don't like using the word toxic masculinity. I prefer restrictive masculinity because that describes when you're placing restrictions against yourself or around others. But like I understand when there's some things that are deemed toxic, of like if you're saying that like all women should be submissive and lesser and they can't have any authority in teaching or leadership. Like I understand that is a toxic belief, no problem there. But when we say that like oh, you're unemotional or you can't cry or like anger is the only emotion that you can show, that lacks a horrible amount of nuance. Because I would say in my research of grade 12 boys aged 17 to 19, one of the stereotypes or assumptions I had going in is that when I talked to the most emotionally restricted and I asked them about it, I thought that some of them would say, oh, I've always been this way. But none of them said that. They all remembered when and why they started to restrict their emotions. And all of their reasons made complete sense. It reminds me of the dean of education at UBC when I did my master's. He was like, what you're doing with these boys is dangerous. And I was like, what? Like kind of taken aback because I thought he was a big fan. He's like, no, what you're doing is dangerous because you're getting them more in touch with their emotions. And if they don't have safety in their context, that can actually be more painful. And it's like research backs this up, is that I think it's so important to have vulnerable, emotionally expressive relationships. So many health benefits.
Yes.
But the only counter to that is that sharing something deeply emotionally personal to someone who responds negatively generally is actually a worse outcome than if you had never said it in the first place. And so that's the constant challenge, I would say, for boys and men, is that yes, you've been hurt and that's why you might be more emotionally restricted, but I'll also encourage you, you can live your life that way of always keeping it closed, but you really can't. Like at the end of the day, to live fully, like you have to venture out there, and you can just do a little bit at a time. You don't have to just unveil your full story when you're drunk with your mates or something like that. But you can just test the waters a little bit, because so many teenage boys are hungry for just a little bit more of deep emotional connection. Not all the time, but just more. They're all mostly hungry for that.
So there's two things. So you identify what point did they start to restrict their masculinity. In essence, in some ways restricting themselves. And the masculine goes into that in a beautiful way, and gives the example of, you go to a class of second graders and you ask them a question and hands go up left and right. You go to a class of sixth graders and you ask them the same question and people start to look around. You might ask them directly, I don't know. So what? It's like, it's begun, right? It's begun where people start to check each other and police each other into meeting the man box, as Colterman calls it, the narrow definitions of manhood and masculinity that we give to boys, whether explicit or implicit in how we raise them. It's so tricky.
That trend of engagement in school goes down, gets its lowest point around grade 10, and then it starts going up a little bit at the end, where you start having more electives and more choice, and you kind of mature a little bit. There's a bit less posturing often. But yeah, context also really matters. Is that most public schools, that would be very true, but I've done research in like more IB schools, and it's like, oh, the different, like they're trying hard, academics isn't seen as lesser being a man, right. But in some schools, oh, you're a try hard. It's not cool to try too hard in certain subjects and things like that.
What's up, everyone? Brandon here, and I want to tell you, you, the busy professional, the dad that's juggling multiple tasks and duties, I want to tell you about something that has transformed my mornings, and it is Magic Mind. Now imagine having energy all day for work, dad duties, and perhaps some to spare in the evenings. A couple weeks ago, I was hitting that afternoon crash hard. The 2 p.m. blues were the soundtrack to my life, and then I got a hold of Magic Mind. Now, this is not just any supplement. It has been developed over 10 years by doctors and researchers with over 200 studies backing its ingredients. Now, this tiny little powerhouse of a shot uses premium nootropics and adaptogens, and thanks to the advanced nano-encapsulation, it absorbs 5 to 10 times faster than any other pill. Now, since adding Magic Mind to my routine, I'm more focused, calm, and that energy sustains all day without the caffeine crash. It's safe, scientifically validated, and it helps me and my wife stay sharp and stress-free. So if you are ready to upgrade your day, head to magicmind.com and use the code UNCHAINED20, that's UNCHAINED20, at checkout to get 20% off your subscription. Now, you can find those links in the show notes. That's magicmind.com. And at checkout, use the code UNCHAINED20. When you support our sponsors, you support our show. So I appreciate you as always. And trust me, you will thank me once you get a hold of this stuff. Got you. Yeah, so the context is really important. Have you noticed any difference in your research when it comes to different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds? Are you noticing more urban communities? Any distinctions there?
There's lots of distinctions. For instance, like if we look at the boy crisis around school and education, like who are the boys that are really bringing down the median or the average of boys' poor educational achievement in the United States? It's predominantly Black boys, and so there's different flavors to it all over the place. Like for instance, in the United States, like football culture has its own uniqueness that's different than hockey culture in Canada, which a lot of the boys I interviewed had, like, their relationship with hockey as being a part of their identity was significant. And their coaches there, either that led them to believe positive things, or the locker rooms that was negative things. So there's like differences like that. But I would say overall, the teenage boy experience is widely the same in feeling uncertain and alone and wanting more connection. But I may have missed your question in there.
No, that's okay. I think it's just important sometimes to identify or have conversations around, disparities in schooling experiences and social emotional development in different groups, because then if we can raise the awareness and raise the conversation, then hopefully resources can then be allocated to make sure that certain schools in certain areas are getting access to this information where it may not be so readily available.
Yeah, absolutely. We do so much comparison between gender, boys versus girls primarily, that we do sometimes get myopic vision of like, oh, there's actually more important subcategories. Like socioeconomic status is a better predictor of health and longevity in life. Like your postal code in the United States or zip code in the United States is a greater predictor than than your genetics even. So yeah, we need to be aware of these different context and environmental epigenetic factors.
What is the most effective, I was going to say healthier, but what is the most effective way to meet, say, 9th grade, 10th grade, let's just say a teen boy? I understand your research has shown different results in different age groups, but let's just say I've got a 9th grader. What is the most effective way to really meet them where they are and begin a conversation? And what does that conversation often look like?
That's a great question. And I'd say the research it's mixed on what's the hardest age group to talk to boys about. And I would say, generally speaking, like grade 8 and 9 is harder than grade 11 or 12 because they've done a bit of less of life. Yes. And so it's kind of like almost easier to talk to boys who have failed or struggled. And then they'll be like, oh, I know I've failed and struggled, and I kind of am a bit more ready to listen.
Sure. And a bit of humbling. Whereas, they may not have peaked yet in 8th or 9th grade.
Yeah. Like I actually just recently asked a bunch of grade 12 boys, because I'm leading a program in the fall for middle school boys. And I was like, what advice would you give to like how this group should look for the middle school boys around grade 8? And they're like,
great question.
Dude, I would have listened to nothing. Yeah. Like there would have been nothing. Which is like that's like a very outlier group that I was talking to in many regards. But so a couple of things is that I think we sometimes view teenage boys, and I kind of also just fed into that stereotype of viewing them as unemotional, unreachable. But that actually is such a fallacy overall.
Yes.
That like people and the University of Edinburgh were like, I don't know if you're going to find participants for your research, because I needed 170 teenage boys in order to have statistical significance for my other stuff. But there was there was a lack of boys following up and getting their parents' signature and bringing that back on time. That was the issue. But the desire to speak about these things, which I know that some of the audience will be like, boys get all the focus, but a lot of these boys feel like they haven't had a chance to share their experience or what it's like to be a teenage boy. They were super eager to do so, And the things that they told me and they shared with me, who I am a relative stranger, like they are so desperate. And so if I'm talking to one boy, long story short, is like you start with a lot of questions. You just get curious about their life and like, oh, what do you, who are you getting information from? Like, who are your mentors? If that's YouTube, Twitch creators, like I can't really have a conversation without knowing them, and so I want to kind of know what they're
Yeah.
consuming.
What's their lens, right?
Yes.
How are they looking at themselves and others? And I think this is a great point to enter into a pretty. This isn't. I wouldn't judge this to be contentious because I feel like parents, educators, researchers like yourself, and even someone like myself who just has very very young child, is social media's impact in the mental health of our kids right now. And there's a great quote, and I don't know where it came from. I think it's something, it might be paraphrased from Joe Ehrman, that when there is an absence of positive male role models in a young person's life, unhealthy role models are going to fill in that void very quickly and very emphatically. And so I can't help but think about the Andrew Tates of the world, the alpha bros that to me, in my judgment, I feel like they're really rolling back a lot of progress. But I also understand and can empathize with young people why they get called to it, because people like Tate aren't saying, "Oh my gosh, these are your emotions," and they feel really bad, and you don't get left in that place. I think some mental health educators do a really ineffective job or effective job of making teens feel really intense emotions and then leave them there. Don't give
Yeah, I
them
would
tools
say
to get
that
out of it.
I would say one of the biggest progressions in education, at least in Canada, is a way more focus on the social emotional well-being of students. But there's been a bit of a pendulum shift about how do we foster resiliency,
Thank you.
and I
Yes.
think that's the key.
So the conversation to me, and I'll finish the Tate bit, just that. So Andrew Tate's calling you a loser. Rather than saying validating your feelings and it being tough and leaving you in that place, he's calling you a loser. And then he's following it with, and you want to do something about it? Which I think speaks to that part of it. I'm sure it's the case for girls and non-binary kids as well, is that, I want to do something about it. I feel activated. I feel engaged. I don't want to sit with this and learn from it and identify how it shows up. No, I want to do something about it. So I understand how people get called in and I dare say trapped in the kind of alpha bro culture.
Yes,
Go ahead, please.
you're absolutely right. And I think that this speaks to the shadow side and the positive side of a lot of male socialization.
Hmm.
And that is, especially like older generations, it's like we either made it through the fire or we didn't. And and a lot of us, in spite of that, where maybe our parents were like, oh yeah, we had no empathy for our emotions or what was going on inside of us, we figured it out. Well, you survived, and you did such a good job surviving. Like, we should 100% honor and applaud that. But don't get trapped into thinking that because I experienced so-called tough love, that that's what made me resilient. It's like, no, that forced you to be in a situation where you learned resiliency, but you didn't learn resiliency because you were alone. You learned it in spite of being alone. And so how do we actually guide? And we do need to do a better job at guiding the youth today of all genders about how to be resilient so that we don't, yeah, because action, like, and that would be the thing, is that action is a positive and a negative of male socialization, of to take action. But we know, like, a lot of marriage counselors and things like that say, like, sometimes they don't want to, your spouse doesn't want to have a fix of the problem, they just want to be seen in the problem as well.
To sit with it. Yeah.
And I think that we men generally have an easier time of being like, okay, that's what women need to do. But we have to also balance of, like, we actually need to sit with ourselves. And this is where we might have a conversation about inner child, to be like, oh, I actually have to respond to the inner child that I have suppressed for good reason growing up. But I have to reassess. It's like, am I still in a survivor context? Like, am I still in a war zone? Or maybe can I unlearn some of that and relearn something that's more integrated, is more positive, because we like to think that, oh, the tough love approach of our parents' generation created better outcomes, but no, like we see this in the workaholism, we see this in addiction through alcohol, like, and suicide rates as well. So things weren't
peachy.
It's not like things were better and peachy. Like we have these rose-colored glasses. Just because you heard about people complaining less, exactly, you heard about people complaining less, doesn't mean that they were less in pain.
There's almost like a frame. It's almost like our parents have their own perspective, because perhaps their parents, like, so my grandparents were Depression era. So, and mum remembers the day they had a microwave. So there's different frames and perspectives, right? Where coming from nothing to having a whole lot of abundance, boomers really have ridden the wave of socioeconomic abundance. And then now comes to our generation where, and with that abundance came a lot of excess in the yuppie eras and alcoholism and addiction. Like this next generation, I judge, is going to look at alcohol like we look at cigarettes right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Like they're gonna pick healthier choices, and I have a lot of hope in them.
Hey, it's Boysen here with the Mankind Podcast. We are closing in on 100 5-star reviews of this podcast, and we have a goal. Brandon and I want to get to 250 5-star reviews. So help us out, will you? Please go to the Mankind Podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. Thank you.
Where I want to pull the conversation kind of to something we've touched is, how much of us trying to meet the emotional needs or challenges that our teenagers are facing, how much of us trying to jump in and help them through it might be stealing some of the necessary rite of passage. Because you're talking about like, oh, tough love got me through it. And perhaps there were certain things that allowed someone to kind of, the hard knocks helped in a way. And knowing that we have an absence of healthy rites of passage in today's culture and society broadly, could there possibly be an element of sometimes kids need to touch the stove and learn, and we can be there from afar, but not try and rescue them from it? That wasn't a clear question, but I wonder if you kind of get my drift here.
100%. It depends on how we define tough love. If by tough love we mean we let them go out on their own, and this is like, all right, consequences, like you do what you do, blah, blah, blah. That is not guidance. That's actually like, what's the word I'm looking for? That's a negation of the parental role. That developmentally, you should be giving more and more autonomy, and your teenager will want more and more autonomy. But it's much like you give them more autonomy to face consequences for the action, but then you also guide them on how to repair. And so it does not mean a removal of consequences or a removal of boundaries. Like one of someone I was talking to recently at the talk in Toronto was like, there was a point in time in my life where my mom said, like, after multiple times run-ins with the police, was like, hey, if you go to jail, like, you're on your own at that point. And he did end up going to jail again, and he was older, like on the end of adolescence, and that was a time period where like he did a lot of introspection. And I would say that there's not one way to do it, but I would say that's an okay approach, to be like, I have this boundary, like I'm trying all these things, at some point you need to make an effort. But we do that so much younger with boys, that we think that they're okay and that they'll figure it out because we figured it out. Or did we figure it out? And also, I think, yeah, we think we do, or we think we're fine. But that's because I think the reaction of like, oh, it's too needy to think of teenage boys or to respond to their emotional worlds, is why I think for a lot of adults is because we haven't responded, and like, let's say a lot of men, we haven't responded to our emotional teenage boys' needs for so long. So why would we want to give space for something when we haven't given space for it in ourselves?
So yes, thank you. And this is such a common place that we end up in conversations on this show. And if I can just continue to hammer in this point to all of our listeners, do your work. You got a problem with how your teenager is showing up or not showing up at school? Where is that true in you? How is that true in you? Because at the end of the day, they learnt some, if not a lot of it, from you. So when I have a grown man who pulled up to a weekend training in a Maserati, thinking like, I'm here to figure out how to lead my family and get them out of it because they don't know how to get their S together. And the next thing you know, a day later, he's face down on a carpet crying because of an unresolved wound or something he experienced from a young age. It's like, yes, that's the acknowledgement. Like, as much as I want to change my teen's behavior, if you haven't been doing any excavating in your own yard,
Yeah.
it's an uphill battle, because I think teens are more tapped into that sixth sense, their intuition, than adults are. And they can see, they may not be able to articulate the hypocrisy in what you're trying to say, but they can feel it. And it's easy to mistrust.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what I said about the teenage boys all knew when they started to restrict their emotions. And one of my TikToks on that topic went a bit viral, and a lot of older men said like, oh, they remember too. But there was some of them who were like, oh, I think I forget. And I think that speaks to what you were saying about teenage boys, is that I think they are closer to the time period when they had to restrict. And some people have experienced so much worse trauma than you could ever imagine at such a younger age that they have cut themselves off and parted themselves much earlier. And so reconnecting is going to be harder. But I think that we need to listen to teenage boys because they reflect how we viewed ourselves. And so if we're triggered by teenage boys' emotions and see them as weakness, it's because we saw that as weakness, and maybe we experience it as weakness because we were bullied for it, or who knows.
Yeah, you spot it, you got it, right? And we see it all the time. I'll give you something to cry about. It's like, man, that was the message you received. That's the message.
Yeah.
It's hard to have empathy for any unresolved stuff you got going on, right? When you see it in your kids. Man, so shout out to all the dads out there that are doing their work. I think that's outside of any strategy for how to lead, support, be a good role model for your kids. If you're turning up to a men's group, if you're getting professional help for your mental health, like, you're doing probably a lot more than you'd give yourself credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, that's the thing about like shaming. I gotta say, like, the Andrew Tate manosphere type influencer culture is super good at shaming you into discipline, which is not at all like an effective approach for whole integration and full humanity. Like, it's amazing how disciplined people are. Like, I almost respect how much you can hate yourself into healing, but I firmly believe you cannot hate yourself into healing. Like, you can't actually hate yourself into prolonged healing in any meaningful way. And I think we try to do that. And so, like, being those fathers, be generous with yourself. Like, I think that a lot of the older generation might feel judged by their sons that are doing the work and seeing the ways like, hey, dad, you actually really hurt me in this way. And the reaction be like, I was trying my best, or like, it's like we can give context for why people the way they are, but we can also still own that still impacts us. And I think the beautiful thing about healing, and why I think like my vision is like more intergenerational relationships between all genders, but between boys and men, is that we have a chance to heal up the lineage and down the lineage, like looking up and down. It's not one or the other. And we can acknowledge like our fathers probably did such a better job than their fathers and things like that. And we don't have to move the needle all the way. Like, health is not a penultimate unwavering state of arrival. It's like a constant ongoing thing.
Oh, man.
Sorry, I'm getting passionate about this, and I don't know how loud I'm talking.
Yes. No, I love the passion. The passion's necessary and needed if we're going to engage and spark thoughts, ideas, and action, right?
And I say this 100%. Like, I don't give a shit about my academic career or my academic work if I'm not also integrating and trying to live by it consistently. Like, I know what it's like to be a safe man because I also recognize when I've not been safe.
Yes.
And that is something that's really high integrity. I view it as very integrous. Like, I don't want my academic head knowledge to be divorced from how I actually show up in the world.
Because people won't trust you.
I don't want to because I don't want to be a hypocrite, but yes, and people don't trust that dissonance.
No.
Or I would say people that live primarily in their head, like more in the realm of logical rationality, they might trust you more because they live primarily in their head and you live in their head, and that is like safe for them, because the body, often where emotions are kept, feels unsafe. And so people can have a complicated relationship of what feels safe or not safe. But generally speaking, people respond to the nervous system of people around them. And I need to regulate my own nervous system is a huge part of, even like before coming on this podcast, like checking in with my nervous system. I was a bit rushed because of toddlers taking poos right before this, but
oh man, I can, it's beneath my nails right now. I can empathize big time with a 1-year-old myself. So yes, to me, what you're talking about is embodiment, right? Integrating this head knowledge into your lived experience as a young father, right? And a husband. And that's where the trust piece comes in for me. I've heard people say the right words, and I used to be spellbound by them. But if I judge they just have not integrated it, if they're not living what they're speaking, it's hard for me to not just trust but connect. And I feel like when I used to live in that head realm, I had a lot of connections people that lived in that head realm, but I didn't know them and they didn't know me from a bar of soap on like that core level.
Yeah, and that's one of my main issues with current debates or discourses around masculinity online, is that from any side, like when you are just intellectually debating something, it's not getting to the actual heart of the matter. Or like men can often get so defensive around different discourses and things like that. And even if I would agree with him or not, that's kind of beside the point. It's like you're missing the human experience. Like, other people aren't being seen, and that's probably why they're lashing out at you, and you're not feeling seen, and so you're batting back and forth.
I remember the first time I saw Jordan Peterson cry, and I went, "Oh, thank God."
Can you explain further?
Yeah, just when stand with him in an intellectual debate, right? It's going to be 12 rounds with Tyson. He's a smart guy, and I'm sure there's certainly threads that could be tugged that are weak spots in his arguments. But when he became vulnerable and spoke about his daughter's sickness, his wife's illness, his own mental health, I was like, oh, finally, because I judge that he attracts a lot of people. I judge that he does a lot of speaking on behalf of people that are having trouble intellectualizing their feelings and communicating their feelings. And when you're just doing it from a head level, they're just words. And when he started to drop in and be vulnerable, I was like, oh, at least he's modeling that emotion's okay, that it can come up. And hopefully those people don't judge that to be, oh, he's being weak now.
Yeah, I think he's a very interesting character, and I think that he does model. I know men who've gone to therapy because of Jordan Peterson, and I think that should be recognized. And I also know that there's a lot of trans, non-binary people who have heard attacks based on his rhetoric that has also caused unsafeness. So it's like, that kind of goes back to what I was saying of teenage boys being both positive examples of masculinity in moments and way more restrictive versions.
Brendan, thank you so much for being here, mate. It's just been wonderful to glean from your experience and your knowledge. I got furious notes here, and I'm coming away a different person as a result of this conversation. So how can people find out more about you? And I can make sure all those notes are there.
My website, remasculine.com. I'm most active on social media, Instagram primarily. And if you sign up for my email list, when I create free resources, you'll get emailed those as well. And if I ever release a book, you'll find out there as well.
Wonderful, mate. Till next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Boyson Hodgson and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. That is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.